Janie was looking for a way home. Jun-suk was looking for a way out of the war. She was a woman who lived by the clock, and he was a man who ruled by the gun. They said it was the wrong place at the wrong time. But for a waitress with no hope and a boss with no soul, that one stray bullet changed everything. One mistake, one ricochet, one life-altering decision. Before the smoke even cleared, Janie realized that the man who had nearly ended her life was the only one capable of saving it. And suddenly, surviving the night wasn't about the wound in her side. It was about the man holding the weapon. You are welcome to this channel, besties. Today's story is a deep dive into loyalty, sacrifice, and a love born from chaos. If you're ready to see how a criminal king gives up his throne for an angel he wasn't supposed to hit, make sure to smash that like button and subscribe for more Afro-Korean tales. Let's get into it. The humidity in the Seoul subway station was stifling, smelling of old grease and ozone. Janie T. Williams leaned against a tiled pillar, her feet throbbing from a 12-hour shift at the diner. It was 4:12 a.m. The digital sign flickered with a cold, blue light. Next train, 8 minutes. The platform was a ghost town, a concrete tomb for the exhausted. Janie closed her eyes, clutching her tips and thinking only of her small apartment and a few hours of sleep. She didn't hear the muffled footsteps of the men in the shadows. She didn't see the glint of the dark gray silk suit or the flash of a barrel. She only heard the deafening crack that shattered the silence of the underground and felt the sudden, white-hot bloom of pain that brought her to her knees. The grease-stained clock above the diner's pass-through window mocked Janie with its slow, jerky movements. 4:02 a.m. Her apron, once a crisp white, was now a map of coffee spills and stray ketchup smears, the battle scars of a 12-hour double shift. In the quiet, neon-lit hum of the Seoul diner, Janie T. Williams was a ghost. She moved with a practiced, numb efficiency, wiping down the counter for the 10th time just to keep her eyes from closing. Everyone she earned was already promised to a landlord who didn't care that her feet felt like they were walking on broken glass, or that the dream of living abroad had turned into a relentless cycle of exhaustion. Go home, Janie. The short-order cook grunted, not looking up from the grill he was scraping. You're starting to look like the decor. Janie offered a tired, lopsided smile and untied her apron. She stepped out into the thick, humid air of the Seoul night, the city's skyline glowing with a cold, indifferent beauty. The walk to the subway station was a blur of neon reflections and oil-slicked puddles. By the time she reached the concrete stairs of the underground, the world felt heavy, as if the air itself was trying to pull her down into the pavement. The platform was a hollow, echoing chamber of ozone and silence. Janie stood near a tiled pillar, her reflection in the darkened glass of the vending machines looking frayed and small. She was just another working-class foreigner, a girl who had come to the city to find herself and ended up finding only the bottom of a tip jar. She checked the digital sign, next train, 6 minutes. She closed her eyes, letting her head rest against the cool tile. In the stillness, her senses sharpened. She heard the distant, rhythmic drip of water somewhere in the tunnels. Then, a sound that didn't belong, the sharp, synchronized click of hard-soled shoes against the platform. It wasn't the gait of a commuter. It was the heavy, purposeful march of men who owned the ground they walked on. Janie opened one eye, seeing shadows shifting at the far end of the platform. A group of men in dark suits emerged from the gloom, their faces set in grim masks of violence. In the center was a man who looked like he had been carved from obsidian, Han Jun-suk. Even from a distance, the authority he radiated was suffocating. Suddenly, the silence shattered. A shout rang out from the tunnel entrance, followed by the deafening, metallic roar of a gunshot. Janie froze, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She saw Jun-suk draw a weapon with terrifying grace, his eyes fixed on a target in the darkness. He fired, a flash of orange light illuminating his focused, lethal expression. But as he pulled the trigger, a rival hitman lunged from behind a pillar, jarring Jun-suk's arm. The barrel jerked. Janie didn't hear the second shot. She only felt the impact. It was a sudden, white-hot bloom of agony in her side that stole her breath. The world tilted. The grimy tiles of the platform rushed up to meet her, and as she collapsed, the last thing she saw was the man in the tailored suit turning toward her, his face breaking into a look of horrific, soul-deep realization. Han Jun-suk did not believe in accidents. In his world, every movement was calculated, every bullet had a name, and every outcome was a result of superior discipline. But as the echo of the stray shot died down, replaced by the sickeningly soft thud of a body hitting the tiles, the foundation of his controlled reality fractured. He didn't look at the rival assassin his men were currently neutralizing in the shadows of the tunnel. His eyes were locked on the splash of crimson blooming across a simple white t-shirt, a stark, violent contrast against the grime of the station floor. "Sir, we have to move. The police will be here in 4 minutes," his lieutenant, Minho, hissed, grabbing his arm. Jun-suk didn't move. He felt the weight of the custom-made pistol in his hand, now a leaden anchor. He was a man of the elite, a shadow king who dealt in high-stakes territories and international ports, yet he had just struck down a civilian who didn't even have shoes on her feet. He watched the woman's head loll to the side, her eyes half closing as her life began to leak onto the cold concrete. She was a nobody in the grand hierarchy of Seoul, yet in this frozen moment, she was the only thing that mattered. He shook off Minho's hand with a silent, terrifying intensity. To flee was the logical choice, the boss choice. To stay was a death sentence to his reputation and his safety. But as he looked at her, really looked at her, he saw the absolute vulnerability of a life caught in the gears of a war it never asked for. Jun-suk lowered himself, the expensive fabric of his dark gray trousers soaking up the cooling blood as he knelt beside her. He didn't stand over her like a conqueror. He came down to her level, his shadow falling over her small frame. His heart, usually a steady, frozen rhythm, thudded with a strange, foreign heat, responsibility. He reached out, his gloved fingers hovering near her neck to check for a pulse. It was there, a faint tapping against the glass of a breaking light bulb. "Change of plans," Jun-suk said, his voice a low, melodic growl that brooked no argument. "We aren't leaving her. Sir, she's a witness. If she lives, if she dies, I am a butcher." Jun-suk interrupted, his gaze never leaving Janie's face. "If she lives, I am still the boss." With a grace that masked his inner turmoil, he slipped his arms beneath her limp body. He felt the heat of her blood soaking into his tailored sleeve, a permanent stain on his carefully curated life. As the distant wail of sirens began to bleed into the tunnel air, Han Jun-suk stood up, cradling the waitress against his chest. He wasn't just carrying a wounded woman. He was carrying the weight of his own salvation, and he knew, with a dark certainty, that the throne he had fought so hard to keep was already starting to slip through his fingers. The first thing Janie registered was the scent, not the metallic tang of blood or the damp ozone of the subway, but the expensive, clean aroma of sandalwood and fresh linen. When her eyes finally fluttered open, the harsh fluorescent lights of the underground had been replaced by the soft, amber glow of a recessed chandelier. She was lying in a bed so vast and soft it felt like a cloud, draped in silk sheets that cost more than a year of her shifts at the diner. For a fleeting second, she wondered if she had died and found a very specific, high-end version of heaven. But then, the pain returned. It wasn't the white-hot scream of the bullet anymore, but a dull, rhythmic throb in her side, anchored by a professional bandage. She tried to sit up, but a hand, firm yet surprisingly gentle, pressed against her shoulder. "Easy," a voice rumbled. It was deep, melodic, and carried the weight of someone used to being obeyed. Janie looked up and saw him. Han Jun-suk had traded his blood-stained suit for a black silk robe, but the intensity in his eyes remained unchanged. He was sitting in a leather chair by the bedside, a digital tablet in his lap, looking like a king presiding over a silent court. The slick-back hair was gone, a few dark strands falling over his forehead, and the neck tattoos peeked out from his collar like warning signs. "Where am I?" Janie's voice was a dry rasp. She looked around the room, taking in the floor-to-ceiling windows that revealed a panoramic view of a mountain mist she didn't recognize. This wasn't Seoul. This was a fortress disguised as a palace. "You are safe," Jun-suk replied, his expression unreadable. "My private doctors have treated the wound. The bullet passed through cleanly." "You were lucky." "Lucky?" Janie let out a bitter, weak laugh. "I was shot at a train station. I need to go. My boss. I'll lose my job." She moved to swing her legs out of bed, but her gaze caught the door. Two massive men in suits stood like stone statues on either side of the heavy oak frame. Beyond the glass of the windows, she could see the glint of a high-perimeter fence and the silhouettes of armed guards patrolling the grounds. "You don't understand, Janie," Jun-suk said, standing up. He walked to the window, his back to her. "The men I was fighting at the station, they saw me carry you out. In their eyes, you aren't a bystander anymore. You are a piece of me. If you walk out those gates, you won't make it to the end of the street." Janie looked at the luxury surrounding her, the gold-leafed mirrors, the velvet curtains, the medical equipment hidden behind mahogany panels. It was a masterpiece of comfort, but as the realization of his words settled in, the room felt smaller. The silk felt like cold metal. She wasn't a guest being nursed back to health. She was a prized possession being stored in a vault. She was in a cage, and no matter how much gold it was plated with, the door was locked from the outside. Days turned into a blur of silence and silver service. Janie's strength returned in small, agonizing increments, allowing her to move from the bed to the wide balcony that overlooked the jagged peaks surrounding the estate. Jun-suk was a constant, haunting presence. He was rarely seen without a phone pressed to his ear or a glass of amber liquid in his hand, his movements as precise and cold as a surgeon's. He was the picture of elite sophistication, until the third evening, when the heat of the humid mountain air forced him to discard the tailored armor of his suit jacket. Janie watched him from the shadows of the hallway as he stood by a mahogany desk, his white shirt unbuttoned at the collar and his sleeves rolled to the elbows. The polished boss she had seen at the station was a mask. The man beneath it was a map of survival. Without the jacket, the subtle ink she had glimpsed earlier was revealed as an intricate, dark vine of tattoos that crawled up his throat and disappeared behind his ears, ancient symbols of a life lived in the mouth of the wolf. As he reached up to rub the back of his neck, the thin fabric of his shirt pulled tight across his shoulders, revealing the jagged, raised white lines of old scars. One particularly deep mark tore across his shoulder blade, a silver reminder of a blade that had come too close to his heart. These weren't the injuries of a man who sat behind a desk. They were the trophies of a man who fought in the dirt. "You're staring," Jun-suk said without turning around. His voice was a low vibration that seemed to pulse through the floorboards. Janie stepped into the light, her hand instinctively touching the bandage on her own side. "I was wondering how many times someone has tried to do to you what you did to me." Jun-suk turned, and for the first time, the cold authority in his eyes wavered. He looked at her, then down at the scars visible through his translucent shirt. "Too many times to count, Janie. In my world, a scar is just a receipt for a lesson learned." He walked toward her, the rhythmic click of his shoes replaced by the soft, predatory thud of bare feet. As he stopped just inches away, the scent of sandalwood was overpowered by something sharper, the smell of gun oil and old leather. Janie realized then that the luxury of the estate, the silk sheets, and the gourmet meals were all just a thin veneer. Beneath the polish, Han Jun-suk was a weapon, tempered by fire and scarred by betrayal. "Every mark on my body cost me a piece of my soul," he whispered, his gaze dropping to the bandage peeking from her t-shirt. "I never intended to add a mark to yours." The air between them grew heavy, charged with a tension that wasn't just fear anymore. Janie looked at the tattoos on his neck, sensing the violence they represented, but she also saw the exhaustion in the set of his jaw. He was a king, yes, but he was a king who had spent every night of his life looking over his shoulder. For a moment, the waitress and the Mafia boss were no longer captive and captor. They were simply two people who had been broken by a city that didn't know how to be kind. The stillness of the estate was shattered not by a sound, but by a shift in the atmosphere. It started with the frantic ringing of encrypted phones and the sudden, heavy presence of black SUVs lining the perimeter. News of the Waitress in the High Castle had leaked into the gutters of Seoul's underworld. To the rival families, Janie wasn't a human being. She was a glitch in Han Jun-suk's legendary armor, a bloody invitation to strike. Jun-suk stood in the war room, the flickering light of security monitors casting a bluish tint over his sharp features. On the screens, thermal imaging showed movement in the dense woods beyond the south gate. Prospectors from the Kong Syndicate testing the fences. The Kong family is moving their shipments into our northern territory, sir, Minho reported, his voice tight with a frustration he could no longer mask. He stood at the edge of the desk, refusing to look at the monitor that displayed Janie's bedroom. They think you're distracted. They think you've traded your teeth for a pet. Jun-suk's jaw tightened, the ink on his neck seeming to pulse in the dim light. They think wrong. Do they? Minho stepped forward, his loyalty finally clashing with his fear. The men are talking, Jun-suk. You spent 400 million won on a private surgical team for a girl who doesn't even know your middle name. You've locked down the Busan shipments just to keep extra guards here. You're bleeding territory to protect a witness who should have been a footnote. Jun-suk turned, his eyes flashing with a predatory coldness that made the room's temperature drop. He stepped into Minho's space, his voice a lethal whisper. She is not a witness. She is my responsibility. If I cannot protect a single woman I broke, how can I protect 1,000 men who follow me? The families see it differently, Minho countered, undeterred. They don't see responsibility. They see a target. They see a weakness that can be exploited to bring you to your knees. If you don't send her away, or finish what you started at the station, you won't have an empire left to rule. From the doorway, Janie listened, her heart sinking. She was the crack in the foundation. She saw Jun-suk look toward her, his expression a tortured mix of the monster he was and the man he was trying to be. He was a king whose throne was built on blood, and now, that blood was calling for hers. The stakes had shifted. It was no longer just about her survival. It was about the collapse of a kingdom, and for the first time, Janie realized that being protected by a mafia boss was just as dangerous as being hunted by one. The moon hung low over the mountains, casting long, skeletal shadows across the floor of the library where Jun-suk sat alone. The amber liquid in his glass remained untouched, his eyes fixed on a map of the city he was rapidly losing. The silence was broken by the soft, uneven tread of Janie's footsteps. She didn't stay in the doorway this time. She walked directly into the center of his sanctuary, her presence a quiet defiance against the heavy, masculine weight of the room. You're losing everything because of me, she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. Jun-suk didn't look up. I am managing the situation, Janie. Go back to your room. Stop ordering me around like I'm one of your soldiers, she snapped, stepping closer until she was standing at the edge of his desk. I spent my whole life being invisible, working jobs where people looked through me like I was glass. I won't let you do it too. Not after you brought me here. Not after you bled for me. Jun-suk finally raised his head. The exhaustion he usually kept hidden behind his boss persona was laid bare. His eyes were bloodshot, the sharp lines of his face softened by a weariness that went deeper than bone. I am trying to keep you alive. That is the only authority that matters right now. At what cost? Janie leaned forward, her dark eyes searching his. Your men are turning on you. Your enemies are burning your warehouses. You think you're saving me, but you're just turning this house into a beautiful grave for both of us. Is your pride really worth more than your life? Jun-suk set the glass down with a sharp click. It isn't pride. It's the only thing I have left. In my world, if you give an inch, they take your head. If I give you up, I give up the only part of me that isn't a monster. The air between them charged, the distance closing as if pulled by a magnetic force. Janie reached out, her fingers tentatively brushing the dark ink on his neck. The skin there was warm and humming with tension. Jun-suk froze, his breath catching. No one touched him like this. Not with curiosity, not with empathy. You're not a monster to me, she whispered, her gaze dropping to his lips before returning to his eyes. "You're just a man who made a mistake and is too terrified to admit he's human." The mask finally shattered. Jun-suk stood up, his hand coming up to cup her face, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw with a desperate, aching tenderness. In that quiet room, far above the violence of the city, the Mafia boss and the Waitress were no longer defined by power or vulnerability. They were just two souls drifting in the dark, finally finding an anchor in each other. As he leaned in, his forehead resting against hers, the war outside felt a lifetime away. For the first time in his life, Han Jun-suk wasn't thinking about his throne. He was thinking about the heartbeat beneath his hand. The peace they had found in the library was obliterated by a sound that shook the very foundations of the estate. A dull, concussive boom that sent a tremor through the floorboards. The security monitors in the corner of the room erupted into static before dying out completely. Jun-suk was on his feet in a heartbeat, the tender man of a moment ago vanishing behind a mask of cold, tactical precision. "They're inside," he said, his voice dropping into a register of lethal calm. He reached into the hidden compartment of his desk, pulling out a heavy tactical sidearm and checking the chamber with a practiced flick of his wrist. Janie stood frozen as the distant staccato of automatic gunfire began to pepper the night air. The golden cage was being torn apart. Before she could speak, Jun-suk was at her side, his hand gripping hers with a strength that was bordering on painful. He didn't lead her toward the main stairs. Instead, he pulled her toward a service panel concealed behind a row of leather-bound books. "Stay behind me. Do not let go of my hand, no matter what you hear," he commanded. They moved through the narrow, concrete veins of the estate's hidden passages. The air here was cool and smelled of damp earth, a stark contrast to the chaos unfolding above. As they emerged into the subterranean garage, the smell of burnt rubber and gunpowder hit them. A black SUV sat idling, its headlights cutting through the gloom like the eyes of a beast. Suddenly, the side door of the garage exploded inward. 3 men in tactical gear swarmed through the smoke, their weapons raised. Jun-suk didn't hesitate. He pushed Janie behind a concrete pillar and stepped into the line of fire. The noise was deafening in the enclosed space, the sharp cracks of his pistol answering the heavy roar of the intruders' rifles. He moved with a terrifying, fluid grace, a man who had spent his life practicing for this exact moment of slaughter. As the last of the intruders fell, Jun-suk turned back to Janie. His dark gray shirt was torn at the shoulder, and a fresh spray of blood, not his own, dotted his cheek. He looked like the monster his enemies feared, yet when he reached for her, his touch remained frantic with concern. "The car, now!" he yelled over the sound of a second explosion from the floors above. He threw her into the passenger seat and vaulted over the hood, the engine roaring to life as he slammed the vehicle into gear. Janie looked out the window, seeing the flickering orange glow of fires starting to consume the luxury she had grown to resent. She was still barefoot, her white t-shirt stained with dust and sweat, clutching the seat as Jun-suk rammed the SUV through the reinforced garden gates. They were no longer in a palace. They were in a war zone, and as the estate vanished in the rearview mirror, Janie realized that Jun-suk wasn't just extracting her from a building. He was tearing them both out of the only world he had ever known. The industrial waterfront of Incheon was a graveyard of rusted shipping containers and low-hanging fog. Jun-suk parked the scarred SUV in the center of a derelict pier, the engine ticking as it cooled. Beside him, Janie sat in the shadows of the cabin, her breath hitching as she watched a fleet of black sedans form a predatory semicircle around them. The headlights blinded her, but Jun-suk didn't flinch. He reached over, his hand lingering on hers for a final, grounding moment. "Stay in the car," he said, his voice a low, gravelly vow. "No matter what you hear, no matter what you see, you stay behind the glass." He stepped out into the biting sea air, his white shirt now a ruin of ash and dried blood. Across the pier stood the heads of the Kong and Sioux families, flanked by a small army of mercenaries. They were smiling, the jagged, hungry smiles of hyenas who had finally cornered a lion. You've caused a lot of trouble for a girl who pours coffee, Jun-suk. Kong sneered, gesturing to the burning horizon where Jun-suk's empire was being dismantled. Your men are gone. Your house is a pyre. Why are we here? To watch you beg. Jun-suk stood tall, the wind whipping his unbuttoned collar to reveal the dark ink on his neck. He looked at the men who had spent decades fearing him. I didn't come here to beg. I came here to settle the debt. He pulled a thick, leather-bound folio from his jacket and tossed it onto the wet pavement between them. It landed with a heavy thud, the sound of a kingdom falling. The deeds to the Busan ports. The digital keys to the offshore accounts in Singapore. The logistics for the northern routes. Jun-suk stated, each word a hammer blow to his own legacy. It's all there. Everything I built. Everything my father built. The rivals went still. The silence that followed was heavy with the scent of salt and greed. Kong stepped forward, thumbing through the documents with trembling fingers. And what is the price for the keys to the city? Jun-suk turned his head slightly, his gaze catching Janie's silhouette through the SUV's window. The price is her. You wipe her name from your ledgers. You forget her face. You let us drive off this pier, and I never set foot in Seoul again. Han Jun-suk is dead. The boss is dead. You get the throne, I get the woman. The rivals exchanged glances, the allure of absolute power outweighing their thirst for blood. They stepped back, parting like a dark curtain. Jun-suk didn't wait for them to change their minds. He walked back to the car with the measured pace of a man who had just traded a crown for a soul. As he climbed back in and gripped the wheel, Janie reached out, touching the scars on his arm. You gave it all away, she whispered, tears blurring her vision. No, Jun-suk replied, shifting into gear and turning his back on the empire forever. I finally bought something worth keeping. The air in the small coastal village was thick with the scent of salt and blooming jasmine, a world away from the suffocating ozone of the Seoul underground. Here, the only rhythmic thud was the sound of the tide against the shore, not the march of men in polished shoes. Janie sat on the wooden porch of their cottage, her skin glowing under the warm Mediterranean sun. She was no longer the invisible girl in the stained apron or the trembling captive in the golden cage. She wore a simple, flowered sundress, and her feet were bare, not out of vulnerability this time, but out of a hard-won peace. Behind her, the screen door creaked open. Han Jun-suk stepped out, but he was almost unrecognizable from the man who had knelt in the blood of the subway station. The tailored dark gray suits had been replaced by a soft linen shirt with the sleeves pushed up, and his hair, once slicked back into a mask of discipline, now fell loosely over his forehead. The luxury wristwatch was gone, replaced by a simple braided band Janie had bought him at a local market. Without the armor of his status, the tattoos on his neck were just ink, and the scars on his shoulders were merely history. He sat down beside her, handing her a glass of chilled juice before resting his hand on the small, unmistakable curve of her stomach. The transition from crime lord to expectant father had been a quiet, internal revolution. In the silence of the afternoon, Janie watched his face, the way the tension had drained from his jaw, the way his eyes no longer scanned the horizon for threats, but instead lingered on her with a fierce, protective softness. You're thinking again, he murmured, his thumb tracing a slow circle against her skin. Just thinking about how quiet it is, Janie replied, leaning her head against his shoulder. I used to hate the silence because it meant I was alone. Now, it just means we're safe. Jun-suk looked out at the water, where the sun was beginning to dip, painting the waves in shades of gold and violet. He had traded an empire for this, a small house, a nameless life, and the chance to wake up without blood on his hands. He knew the world he left behind would continue to churn, but he was no longer a gear in its machine. He was just a man, holding the woman he had accidentally broken and intentionally healed. I promised you a life away from the shadows, he said, his voice a low, steady vow that no longer needed the weight of a weapon to back it up. Janie smiled, closing her eyes as the breeze caught her hair. The errant bullet had been meant to end a life, but instead, it had pierced through the walls they had both built around their hearts. As the stars began to poke through the twilight, The Mafia boss and the waitress watched the horizon together, finally realizing that the greatest power wasn't in ruling a city, but in having something precious enough to walk away from it all.